Okay, so good morning. My name is Shelby. I am the adult librarian at Skaneateles Library. Thank you for joining us today. Um, Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone is muted during Jeff's presentation, just to avoid any interruptions. And there will be time for questions at the end. You can throw those in the chat if you'd like, or unmute yourself at the end and ask Jeff yourself. So Jeff Brownscheidle has his dad to thank for the love of wilderness adventure. Long before he was an engineer, a boyhood fascination with the world that exists where roads end and trails begin had taken root. Better known as Mountain Man among hiking circles, he has completed nearly 9,000 miles of long distance hiking on some of America's greatest trails, all with a pair of his beloved Chacos underfoot. He lives in Seattle with his wife and hiking buddy Emily and chronicles his adventures at stoneandsky.net. Jeff and his wife are planning another 1,500 miles of hiking this year on a combination of the Long Trail, the John Muir Trail, and the Arizona Trail, which is astonishing. So Jeff, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Shelby, and thanks everyone at the Skaneateles Library for hosting me for a second time. Thanks to all of you for joining and taking time out of your hopefully starting to be post-pandemic summertime here. And if you happen to catch the last talk I gave to the library about hiking the Triple Crown, or have been to the About Me page of my blog, Stone and Sky, this picture will look familiar. That's me on my dad's back on a Sunday afternoon in Allegheny State Park. Every talk I give about hiking begins here, and for good reason, because it's sort of where it all began. This shared connection to the outdoors that my dad and I both had. And without this day, all the hikes that followed in the 40 years since may not have happened. So 6 weeks ago, I left behind the only career I've ever known, as an engineer no less, to focus full-time on hiking and writing. And for the 18 years I was an engineer, my daily life kind of looked like what you see here, staring at a bunch of screens, working on a microprocessor design team. A big part of what drew me to engineering was this challenge of looking deeply into patterns, finding connections between things, and using that understanding to make what we did and how we did it more efficient over time. But over that same time, I became interested in connections of a different, less tangible sort, the ones that inform what we do in life and why. For me, spending time on long trails has always been the best fuel for that kind of internal exploration, to better understand life by studying mountains rather than screens. And you can find almost anything you want to know about hiking, about gear, about trail logistics or trip planning, backcountry skills by taking a class or thumbing through any number of the thousands of sites you can find on the subject from Google. But you won't find very much of that on my blog, Stone and Sky, because it's not what I personally find most compelling about being in the wilderness. What I've always been most fascinated by is that despite appearances, there's so much connective tissue between two seemingly very different experiences, life at home on one hand and life on the trail on the other. And the main thread of what I write for Stone and Sky has always been to explore those connections. So for this talk, I'm going to take you along some of the threads that connect three different hiking trails in the American West: the John Muir, the Tahoe Rim, and the Wonderland trails. And if you happen to catch that talk back in March, I mentioned about hiking the Triple Crown, or have read Cheryl Strayed's book, Wild, you might recognize this map. This is the Pacific Crest Trail, running from Mexico to Canada through California, Oregon, and Washington. And all three of the trails I'm going to talk about today either share tread with the Pacific Crest Trail or are within sight of it. They're shown in blue here. There's two in California and one in Washington State. But before we jump into the trails themselves, I'm going to start things off just a little bit differently. But anyone who's hiked in the Northeast can relate to this picture. This is quintessential hiking in the East, except maybe without the luxury of a staircase in this particular photo. But it's this endless sea of bright green foliage of summer. And this happens to be in the Adirondacks, but could just as easily be anywhere in the Appalachian Mountains. And with vibrant greenery like this, you can see why the nickname of the Appalachian Trail is the Long Green Tunnel, largely because we're rarely short on water anywhere here in the East, thanks to winter snowpack and a wealth of spring and summer rain. But if we only define reality by what we see out our own front door, there's a lot we miss. It's easy to forget that elsewhere in the country and certainly in the world, it's a very different story. Out on the West Coast and in the Mountain West, hiking can often look quite a bit different than we're used to in the East, because a surprising amount of the time you're walking through something like this, areas that have been devastated by wildfires, some numerous times. This is made extra ghostly in this photo because it's actually hailing here. Those little white dots you see falling through the frame and starting to accumulate on the ground. But there's something especially different about experiencing these areas on foot. There's a real sense of scale that comes with moving through them at such a slow pace. And it makes it impossible not to be affected by what you see. And lest you think that getting up close with forest fire, either past or present, is a rarity, what you learn pretty quickly hiking in the West is that the impact of fire is everywhere. And these photos are from hikes only in the past 6 years. There are plenty more that didn't make this Wildfire Hall of Fame. In healthy ecosystems, fire plays a critical role in the revitalization of forests. But part of the reason for why fire plays an increasingly prominent role in hiking Western trails is because of how climate change is fueling this exceptional pattern of drought. So just to underscore how significant drought is right now in the West, this is a satellite image of Shasta Lake taken 2 years ago, courtesy of NASA's Earth Observatory. It is the largest reservoir in the state of California. In fact, it's just west of the Pacific Crest Trail in Northern California here. As of just a few weeks ago, Shasta Lake now looks like this. The bathtub ring you now see is because in just the 2 years since the previous photo, the water level in Shasta Lake has dropped 106 feet. It's nearly a 50-year low. And other reservoirs in California and across the West tell a similar story. And to add insult to injury, in real current events, exactly 2 weeks after this photo was taken, a wildfire began burning along the shore of this lake, just in the upper left portion of this photo. And aside from what this obviously means for thousands, if not millions of people in the West, what does this mean for hikers? It means a few things: that wildfire season now stretches through almost the entire hiking season of spring, summer, and fall. It means that fire restrictions, including on allowable types of backpacking stoves and fuels, and whether they can be used at all, are certainly becoming the norm. It also means that the risk of wildfire either interrupting or derailing completely through hikes on Western trails continues to climb. I titled this talk "In the Land of Dust and Fire" because so much of the American West is a land that is shaped by fire, both wildfire and volcanic activity. And those forces play a big role in what connects these three trails. Lovingly referred to as the West Coast to mini Triple Crown amongst my hiking friends. If the real Triple Crown was a bit intimidating at over 7,000 miles, these trails represent something much more approachable. They can be had for the low price of less than 500 miles. And they're also three trails I could hike every year and never get tired of, because they're about as good as backpacking ever gets. You can safely say that if you don't care for these three, backpacking just isn't for you. If you've never hiked in the West at all, one thing you may not expect in light of how much taller the mountains are is that the hiking tends to be, physically at least, much easier than it is in the East, thanks to modern trail building. Rather than old, eroded, and rough point-to-point trails you see in the East, the trails of the West are generally very modern. They're switchbacked. You'll certainly have occasional navigation and altitude challenges to contend with, and your thighs will certainly still burn from all the up and down you'll have to do. but the trails themselves tend to be even and not nearly as rock and root choked. Case in point, this is a pretty standard Eastern trail with more scrambling with hands and feet than walking. And if it's not that, you might find your fair share of mud like this along the way too. Whereas out on the Western trails, you're far more likely to find something that looks downright civilized by comparison, or perhaps something like this. But I often like to say that growing up in the East teaches you to love hiking for hiking's sake, no matter what it looks like, to suffer just a little bit for something you love. Because even in spite of all that extra effort, hiking the East often only leads you to viewless summits like this one. It's my mom and I. Whereas out West, well, it kind of feels like they're getting their cake and eating it too, with summit views like this one, which probably explains why we moved there. So today we're going to start with the John Muir Trail, which my wife Emily and I hiked in 2015. It is 211 miles, and it runs from Yosemite Valley in the shadow of Half Dome and El Capitan, and ends on the summit of Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48 states. And along the way, it's going to share 160 of those 211 miles with the Pacific Crest Trail. Traversing the heart of what he called the range of light, it follows the footsteps that Muir himself had taken over the course of his many wanderings in the Sierra. He described it like this: the mighty Sierra, miles in height, and so gloriously colored and so radiant, it seemed not clothed with light, but wholly composed of it. Then it seemed to me that the Sierra should be called not the Nevada or Snowy Range, but the range of light. So here we are in Yosemite Valley, perhaps the world's most famous valley. My wife Emily here with El Capitan in the background. And a bit of pop culture, if you've seen the movie Free Solo that follows Alex Honnold's climb of El Capitan without a rope, his route is just about straight up the middle of the face you're looking at here, right over Emily's right shoulder. The irony of when you set out from Yosemite Valley on the John Muir Trail, looking back at these iconic scenes like Half Dome here, everyone is telling you about how big the climb to the summit of Mount Whitney is going to be at the end. But what they miss is that the biggest climb of the entire trail isn't climbing Mount Whitney, it's climbing out of Yosemite Valley. In the first dozen miles, you'll have climbed 6,000 feet. And 20 miles later, you'll end up here, about to exit Yosemite National Park. And you might be wondering why these first few photos have all been black and white. And that's in honor of the person who took the next one. A person who needs no introduction. This is a Moon and Half Dome taken in 1960 by Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams photographed Yosemite Valley thinking it would be the best way to rally people to the cause of preserving such an incredible place. Everyone knows the expression that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Ansel Adams went further. He said that a true photograph need not be explained, nor can it be contained in words. And believe it or not, although everyone thinks of Ansel Adams's famous black and whites, he actually did work in color photography, but he had this distaste for it. He said he felt constrained by color, that he could be more expressive with the tones of black and white. I think John Muir would have approved that black and white images like those of Ansel Adams were more befitting to capture his range of light. But from here on out, we're not going to try and mimic Ansel Adams, and we're going to wave goodbye to his signature black and white and embrace full Technicolor. And we also wave goodbye to Yosemite National Park. We watch this beautiful interplay between light and shadow, strolling by places like Banner Peak and Garnet Lake at sunrise, Silver Pass, and eventually we're going to land at a bit of an unusual resupply stop, Here we are at Muir Trail Ranch. This is just a mile off of the trail. And I say unusual because the ranch is not a town. It's 11 miles from the nearest road, smack in the middle of the High Sierra. Everything here is trekked in on pack animals, including the 5-gallon buckets you see lined up in the photo. Those are the resupply buckets you mail to the ranch for the convenience of having it waiting for you here so close to the trail. So fully loaded with 7 days worth of food on our backs, we're setting out from Muir Trail Ranch. That didn't make the next few climbs any easier, and neither did this thick haze of smoke that was quickly becoming a fixture every afternoon. This was courtesy of a large wildfire burning just to the south of us. And although we weren't in harm's way, it was close enough to leave flecks of ash on our tent most evenings. But every morning, the smoke would be nothing but a memory, leaving behind this brilliant blue sky hanging over these rocky moonscapes. And on the morning of Emily's birthday, we arrived here, the hut at Muir Pass, one of only 2 shelters along the entire trail, both of which are really only for emergency use. And as we started to walk away from Muir Hut, Emily turned around and took this photo, because you almost can't believe this color gradient you see in the sky. I promise you, this is not Photoshop. It's not a trick of the camera. It's the actual color of the sky. It's an effective altitude. The higher you climb, the more it takes on this mesmerizing, deep azure blue color. And it was extra brilliant in contrast to the smoke that would replace it each afternoon. Descending from Muir Pass now, like clockwork, this scrim of wildfire smoke gets pulled across the landscape. But come morning, once again, it's as though it never happened. It's early in the morning here. I took this photo of Emily as we're climbing up from the river valley you see out there in the distance. And she's standing on what's known as the Golden Staircase. It's a series of just shy of 100 switchbacks carved from walls of sheer rock. And not surprisingly, this was the last section to be built when the trail was finally completed in 1938. The Golden Staircase reminds you that the John Muir Trail has a very distinctive rhythm to it, because along the way you have to climb over 8 major passes, ranging from just shy of 11,000 to over 13,000 feet. It's a distinct pattern of a long ascent to a high pass, followed by a long descent to the next river valley, only to have the pattern repeat again. And by the time it's all done, you'll have climbed over 47,000 feet in total. You'll have walked through 3 national parks, Yosemite, Kings Canyon, and Sequoia, the last of which you enter here when you crest Forester Pass, which is the last and the highest of the passes. And as you descend from Forester Pass, you get to appreciate another marvel of trail engineering, because when you look back at it from a distance, you can hardly believe a trail could be built of such a thing. And blasted into the rock leading to the V-shaped pass right above Emily's head in this photo is a trail leading to Forester Pass. So down from Forester Pass, finally, you find yourself on this heavenly place called Bighorn Plateau. This is the place where my friend Beardo wants to have his ashes spread. I don't blame him. You have one climb left in front of you, up to the end of the trail on the summit of Mount Whitney. It's the anvil-shaped peak you see rising in the distance, right about in the center of this photo. And the closer you get, the more likely you are to pass one of these. This is a train of pack animals, combined with the type of soil in the Sierra and the unrelenting sun and wind it gets throughout the summer months. The hooves from these pack animals pulverizes the trail into this fine dust that kicks up with every step you take. Until finally we landed here at our last campsite. It is now September 5th, the day of our 5th wedding anniversary, in fact. And we're at a place called Guitar Lake, right at the foot of Mount Whitney. It's also the place where the blog Stone and Sky gets its name. There's certainly a literal connection between that name and what you see here. But it's also reflective of a landscape that has been stripped down to its barest essentials, a bit like the through hikes on which we traverse it. So we watched the sun melt into the west one last time. We had a few restless hours of sleep before waking on our 14th day in the middle of the night. We climbed 3,000 feet higher under headlamp to catch the first rays of sunlight from the summit of Mount Whitney. And at 14,500 feet, the summit of Mount Whitney is the tallest peak in the continental US, and it's also the end of the John Muir Trail. But there's a particularly cruel twist to finishing the John Muir Trail on the top of Mount Whitney, because you're still 11 miles away from the nearest road. And the only thing separating you from that road is a knee-buckling 6,000 feet of descent. But when you finally get there, drinking Sierra Nevada is obviously the only acceptable form of celebration. And the great irony of finishing the John Muir Trail is that John Muir himself probably would not have approved of the way in which we traveled through his beloved Sierra, because never one to hold his tongue. When he was asked what he thought of hiking, this is what he had to say: "I don't like either the word or the thing. People ought to saunter in the mountains, not hike." Do you know the origin of that word, saunter? It's a beautiful word. Way back in the Middle Ages, people used to go on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And when people in the villages through which they passed asked where they were going, they would reply, "à la Santerre," to the Holy Land. And so they became known as saunterers or saunterers. Now these mountains are our Holy Land, and we ought to saunter through them reverently, not hike through them. With our hike of John Muir's range of light behind us, and perhaps having pissed off his ghost in the process, 3 years went by. We finally returned to California, endeavored to make amends by truly sauntering our way along the Tahoe Rim Trail. And in that sense, it's kind of the interlude of these three trails, because at 170 miles in length, just 40 miles shorter than the John Muir Trail, it has only half the amount of elevation change. And that meant there would be plenty of time to saunter and make John Muir proud. Aside from being a gentle, modern trail, since it's a loop, the Tahoe Rim Trail is also a logistically simple trail to hike. So it's a great trail for anyone looking to dip a toe into long distance backpacking for the first time. We joined our friends Beardo and Sweet Pea for an early September through hike, where views of the lake are never far away. And we're not even at the end of our first day. And we looked back at where we come from, and we saw this plume of smoke rising only a few miles behind us. And our first thought, of course, was, great, yet another wildfire burning in the west. And we later found out this blaze was actually the result of a tragic crash of a small airplane just hours after we'd hiked through the trail in that area. The Tahoe Rim Trail is the baby of the bunch. It was only completed in 2001. But what also sets it apart from the other two is that it's a multi-use trail. Lake Tahoe is a big mountain biking destination, and most of the trails outside of wilderness areas are open to bikes. And the effect that the added bike traffic has, combined with the sun-baked summer, is that the trail bed becomes almost powdery. These little dust plumes kind of issue with each step. And combine that dust with what we saw on the horizon, it really felt like we were in the land of dust and fire. This smoky haze, again, courtesy of wildfires, similar to what we saw on the John Muir Trail. And again, leaving small dusting of ash on us each night. The first week of September is a pretty fun week for Emily and I every year. We have both of our birthdays and our wedding anniversary all within 4 days of each other. And more often than not, we're celebrating that week while out on a trail somewhere, typically being goofy like this. And it's doubly fun because around the same time, for 50 miles along the west side of Lake Tahoe, the Tahoe Rim Trail joins the Pacific Crest Trail and heads into the Desolation Wilderness, one of the absolute highlights of the entire trail. It's sort of this echo of the John Muir Trail, a landscape that seems like it's been misplaced, like it's been unmoored and set adrift from the high Sierra to the south, with these shimmering lakes beneath domes of sloping granite. Most of all, hiking the Tahoe Rim Trail truly was as close as I've ever come to the sauntering John Muir espoused, because when you walk a loop around something, you have an opportunity to build a kind of intimacy with it. And just like with people, you get to understand them from different angles. Here, how you got to see how the lake changes with the color, how the lake changes color with light, how it shimmers under a little breeze. You got to wonder what kind of rock this is under this whimsical sky. You got to watch the sunset illuminate tips of nearby mountains as you strolled past. And we even embraced our inner naturalists, becoming fascinated with the different tree species in the Lake Tahoe Basin, like this ancient Sierra juniper that has kindly offered up a seat for Birdo. And it turns out that learning to identify the native trees takes on a particularly special meaning when your shelter depends on it. This is our last night on the trail. And as I laid in my hammock, the first time we'd ever done a through hike using hammocks, in fact, I wrote a post to Stone and Sky called Forever a Student, because one of my favorite expressions is an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less. And the reason I love this sentiment about the downside of expertise is that there really is this wisdom and an openness to always being a beginner at something, because no matter how many miles we've hiked, trying something new and learning from it is how we grow, by forever being a student. But in true sauntering fashion, we found ways to make time stretch on our last day with a few lounging stops like this with nature's recliner, before we finally came full circle back to where we began. So we have two legs of the so-called mini Triple Crown behind us. And for the final leg, our story travels 750 miles to the north, to a slightly different kind of dust and fire, to Mount Rainier and the Wonderland Trail that does a 93-mile loop around it. And to really appreciate the Wonderland Trail, you first have to understand the scale of the mountain it wraps around. If you've never been to Seattle, this is the view from the city, day after day in the summertime. We've lived there for over 15 years now, but no matter how many times you see it, you never really get used to this view. Because after 9 months of hiding in the gray clouds, this icy giant that is Mount Rainier appears. And even this photo does not do it justice, because despite being 60 miles away, it's really Rainier that lords over the Space Needle and not the other way around. Up close, it is certainly no less impressive, largely because of how much bigger it is than anything around it. It is almost incomprehensibly massive. At 14,410 feet, it is the 5th tallest peak in the continental United States, but its prominence, its height relative to the land around it, is what really makes it stand out. There are only 20 peaks in the world that stand out more from the land that surrounds them. And this is a real contrast to the John Muir Trail, where you're walking towards Mount Whitney, and it's difficult to know which mountain it is exactly that you're walking towards. Because despite being 100 feet shorter than Whitney, there is no such confusion around Mount Rainier. When I set out in 2018 to hike the trail with Emily and our friend Julie, it was for the 3rd time. And aside from stunning views, which even the locals like this little marmot seem to enjoy, the reason I keep coming back to this trail is because you get the distinct sense that Mount Rainier is a mountain that is alive, which is an admittedly odd perspective on what is ostensibly a massive pile of rock and ice. I wrote a blog post at the time called Permanence that tried to capture this. As you hike around Rainier on the Wonderland Trail, you know that the snow levels you see come and go with the seasons. But it feels like the rock, these glaciers, somehow transcend time. It's hard to imagine anything, in fact, being more permanent than this giant mountain is. And you slowly come to realize this contrast of something that simultaneously appears impervious to the passage of time, but up close is changing constantly. And you get to experience the forces shaping that change up close. You can hear the glaciers creak and groan as they move, spawning waterfalls like this one. Or release meltwater into rivers, where boulders moving under the water create this sound of dull thunder that you can hear as you cross them. You can even feel the wind as a force of change on the landscape, conveniently turning me into a human map in this case. All of those forces hint at something that's equally hard to imagine, especially on an idyllic, calm day. That underneath this spectacular veneer of rock and ice is a mountain with a fiery past and possibly a very fiery future. Mount Rainier is considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world. And because of its 26 glaciers, the largest system of glaciers in the continental US, in fact, the threat from Rainier isn't a spectacular eruption like you might think of from Mount St. Helens. Instead, Rainier has a history of eruptions releasing what are known as lahars. And lahars are destructive rivers of mud and debris. And some of them have reached as far as the suburbs of South Seattle in the past, some 60 miles away. Hiking the Wonderland Trail also comes with its own pattern, similar to the John Muir Trail. Instead of high passes, though, here you ascend and descend a series of massive ridges that divide each glacial drainage from the next. At the bottom of each, you cross the river that drains the upstream glacier, sometimes by fording the river, sometimes on log bridges like the previous photos, or sometimes on a high suspension bridge like this. And if while crossing that suspension bridge, you pause to look down at the water beneath you, you'll notice that it looks kind of like chocolate milk. In fact, it's in effect known as glacial milk or rock milk, because the water is carrying so much fine pulverized rock that's being held in suspension. And for hikers, this is important because in spite of there being water seemingly everywhere, rivers like this will destroy a water filter in minutes. And it's the same finely pulverized rock that at times gives the trail a powdery, almost moon dust-like quality. Okay, probably not the image you're expecting to see next. There's a reason I'm slipping this in here. And it's because I mentioned earlier that in 2018, this was my third trip around the Wonderland Trail. While we were on that hike, I thought a lot about what it's like to revisit memory, to re-experience places that hold such detailed memories. And it made me think of this famous painting, which you probably already recognize. This is Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, 1931. It hangs in New York's Museum of Modern Art. And aside from its melting clocks and bizarre dreamscape, what strikes me most about it when you see it in person is its size. It's barely larger than a sheet of paper. And its size creates this kind of intimacy because it draws you in, invites you to inspect it up close. At the time, I wrote a post thinking of Persistence of Memory and also titled the post Persistence of Memory, because similar to the painting, being on trails like this is what draws me in. It invites me to examine my place in time, to ponder the boundaries between my own memory, dreams, and reality. A day later, the trail took on its own version of a dreamscape atmosphere, reminding us that a mountain like this makes its own weather. And the fun of days like this is what it creates in terms of an air of curiosity. At any moment, this cloud might lift and you're wondering, what am I going to see when it does? Will I see a marmot posing for his close-up? Or maybe a basin with thickets of deep purple lupin? Or maybe I'm going to see this, the imposing north face of Rainier known as the Willis Wall. It's capped by a glacier spilling down from the summit. The bottom of that wall, you can just barely make out the head of the Carbon Glacier. It is the largest and lowest elevation glacier in the United States outside of Alaska. And minutes before I took this photo, I took this one, which certainly requires some explanation as to what this little guy is. You're looking at a little plastic gnome figurine that we lovingly named What Else? Gnomey. So late in the evening, 4 days earlier, it's our first day on the trail, we'd found Gnomey wedged into the bark of a tree. And conveniently, he came with a little message that said this, said, "Lucky you, you found me a magical woodland gnome. I'll be your friend for being observant while visiting my home. Please hide me again on the forest trail when your visit here is done, and continue this game of hide and seek so others can share in the fun. Keep me on the trail." So here we were on our last day of the Wonderland Trail, taking this goodbye photo with Gnomey before respecting his wishes and nestling him into the bark of a tree next to the trail for someone else to find. And he was now some 60 trail miles from where we'd found him. So we waved goodbye to our friend Gnomey, and we watched Julie cross one final log bridge in style. We also watched the last few miles of our hike come to an end. And like seeing the many sides of Lake Tahoe from the Tahoe Rim Trail, we'd gotten to see Rainier from its many sides, its jaw-dropping beauty and its little clues of the fire it holds deep within. At the end of every hike, there's this paradox that I like to call the completion conundrum. It's this mixture of excitement for the celebration, and in this case, the shower and the bed that are waiting, mixed with this empty feeling, knowing that this is all coming to an end. And it's ultimately that conundrum that never fails to draw me out onto the next trail. And when you finally get here to the aptly named Skyscraper Pass, and you pause to look back on this mountain, this view, and on this trail that is more than a century old, you realize how much of a wonderland this place truly is. And just like the Muir Trail, there's only one acceptable way to celebrate. And if you enjoyed hearing about these trails and want to learn more about them, or maybe the ones that we have coming up this year, or if you have questions about gear or trip planning and preparing to hike a long trail of your own, please send me an email at mountainman@stoneandsky.net, or go to the site and subscribe to be a part of our future adventures. And most of all, thank you very much for all being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. If we can open up for questions now, if anybody has any questions for Jeff. I actually have one myself.
Go ahead.
Do you have any interesting stories about coming across wild animals in your hikes? Have you come across like bears or any scary happenings with it?
I'm smiling only because I guess it depends on your definition of interesting, right? I have seen somewhere in the order of 70 or 80 bears over the years. And what people, they're probably the first animal that people ask about. I'm disappointed when I don't see them. They, for such a large animal, they tend to be very skittish. I would be far more concerned about seeing a bear in the front country, where people tend to be camping and they tend to be snooping around for food. In the backcountry where they're not habituated to people, seeing a bear is a totally different experience. They're wonderful to see. You tend to get startled by them as they bolt through the woods. In fact, when Emily and I were on the Continental Divide Trail last year in Montana, we saw 3 within 24 hours, and they were quite close, maybe 20 yards off. They're wonderful to see. Maybe an occasional rattlesnake in the desert. They startle you as you're kind of looking down at your feet, trying not to trip on something, and then you hear this rattle. But nothing I would say that ever approached, being concerned about where you were. I once had coyotes, kind of doing circles around my tent on the Appalachian Trail. That was interesting in the middle of the night, but nothing I would say that was fear-inducing in any meaningful way.
Do you pack any like first aid items in case you do, like for snakes, if you a venom? Do you have like a venom kit or?
I don't take an anti-venom kit. There's some of the wisdom, particularly around snake bites, has changed over time. You hear these old wives' tales of scoring an X in the skin above where the fangs of a snake would be done, and doing things like sucking it out or things you might see in a movie. Those are all not things people should do. The best remedy, and the reason why I don't carry an anti-venom kit, is one, they tend to do a very good job of alerting you to where they are. So there's the situation of stepping on a snake and having it bite you and have it being venomous. I mean, I would go buy a lottery ticket if it happened to me, to be honest, because you've really struck the jackpot. The real remedy is you just have to get yourself out and get treated for it, and really identify the snake that that may have bitten you, so that you can get the proper anti-venom. Yeah, I mean, as far as a kit, I mean, I take a very simplistic kit. This is one of those cases where you shouldn't carry things, you should carry skills, right? And the more skills you carry, the fewer things you can take. Short of something really awful, in which case you have a much bigger problem on your hands. There's not much you can't handle with a handful of gauze, Band-Aids, antibiotic ointment, an antihistamine if someone were to have an anaphylactic reaction. That's the list. It's probably about something that fits in a container about this big and maybe weighs an ounce.
We did get a question. Which trail of the mini Triple Crown is your favorite? Be honest.
That's really hard. It's hard to beat the Sierra to me. The John Muir Trail probably be my guess. It's just spectacular. If anybody has never been to California's High Sierra, I mean, the weather in the summertime there is so predictably gorgeous, and the scenery is spectacular. It is a little bit of a pain, and it's actually true both of the John Muir Trail and of the Wonderland, to get a permit. They're both permitted trails that are very competitive, very, very hard to get a permit these days. In fact, we tried to get one for, you mentioned the top, Shelby, we're going to be doing the John Muir Trail later this year. We didn't get a permit, so we're hoping to get a walk-up permit when we go in September. We tried, I think, for a window of, you get re-entered in the lottery every day up to 3 weeks, and we did not get it. So this is very difficult. If I had to pick one, I'd pick the John Muir Trail.
We got a question from Brian. You talked a bit about the slow pace of sauntering. Which do you prefer, sauntering or hiking?
Well, Brian is Beardo, in case anyone knows. So he's tuning in and asking a leading question. It's a bit of both. I like variety, right? Variety is the spice of life, so to speak. There are times when it feels great to feel like you're going from point to point and making a lot of progress. I like a mixture. That gets tiring after a while. I mean, when you feel like you have to hike, especially on the Western trails, to do some of the Triple Crown ones, to do 25 miles a day, day after day starts to feel a little bit like work. at least in some stretches, whereas sauntering feels wonderful. But then you feel like if you saunter for forever, you're not seeing but a fraction of what you could see if you were a little more assertive, so to speak, in what you're trying to accomplish. So an unsatisfying answer for Beardo. It's both. I think I'd put it this way: hiking without a little bit of sauntering sprinkled in feels a little empty to me.
How important are hiking poles? How vigorous are some of the climbs?
It's a great question. So up until I've had hiking poles, first of all, on every long trail I've done since 2002. I did not use them actually right up until 2002. I hiked the long trail, which is what Emily and I are going to go back and hike together this summer. In fact, in a couple of weeks. And up until then, I didn't understand this. I didn't understand why people used hiking poles. And right at the last minute, the friend and I who we hiked together went and got pairs. And I think it took us a handful of days to get used to it and to realize, I don't think I can ever go back from this. What I find most helpful about them are, one, they can be very multi-use. If you have a shelter that uses poles, there's a lot of shelters these days that are designed to use trekking poles as their structure. So it saves you the weight of carrying dedicated tent poles, which really don't have a great alternate use when they're not in tent mode. You tend to, try and trim down your pack weight by trying to find things that can be used for a multitude of different uses. Some tent poles are straight, so they would be nice for splinting an injury, for example, but that's about it. But in their actual hiking usage, poles I find take a huge amount of strain off of my knees, particularly when going downhill. I've been a skier since probably almost as long as I could walk. I've been a skier, and I feel like having poles reminds me as a skier to be in this forward position when going downhill, as opposed to kind of resisting gravity, and that's where people get knee injuries. I find it puts you in a much more kind of athletic posture and is just much more comfortable that way. As far as the vigorousness of the climbs, I suppose it's in the eye of the beholder to some extent. On these particular trails, I mean, they're certainly vigorous because they're at altitude. Climbing to the summit of Mount Whitney, for example, at almost 15,000 feet, is vigorous, but the trail is not particularly steep. In fact, it's graded for those pack animals I showed a photo of. They kind of graded to a maximum to allow for pack trains to traverse. So I wouldn't say it's steep. It's not rocky Rudy. It just goes on for a long time, and it can be thousands of feet. So personally, as an East Coast boy, I mean, I think it's easier, by a lot, because it's not so scrambly. But it's a different kind of challenge.
Do you do any preparation, Jeff, before you go out on the trail in regards to, physically? Do you do specific exercises to get ready, or?
I'm laughing because before this, I think I did nothing this morning while Emily did 3 workouts. So I'm thinking I should probably do more of that. I mean, this is a little bit funny. I think, the more you can do to be on your feet, because that's really the change, right? Aside from, you can't really mimic hiking for 12 hours a day, right? If you do, you're already on a trail doing it. So the thing people, I think, need to get used to is you're on your feet for such a long period of time. So any activity you can get out there and be on your feet, any kind of exercise, weight training, running, whatever it might be, the more you can do of it, the better. Personally, this is the upshot of hiking, a couple thousand miles in a year, is I want to eat more. My preparation is to put on weight in preparation for losing it, because it's a question of how long can you delay the point where your body is consuming muscle rather than fat reserves, because that's when you start to get awfully tired. But really, any kind of activity would do. If I had an infinite amount of time, I'd probably throw a few things in a backpack and just get out on a trail and do as much walking as I could. Nothing terribly fancy. I think there was one other question I see at the very top of the chat, Shelby, actually, about climate change. How has climate change affected the glaciers on Mount Rainier? So I wish I had more statistics to give a more detailed answer on this particular question. The best way to look at, there's some photography around. I mentioned the Carbon Glacier. So it's the lowest elevation glacier. I believe it's also the thickest glacier outside of Alaska. And there's a whole bunch of studies on the Carbon Glacier about its advance and retreat over the years. And it should come as no surprise to anybody that they're all in retreat, right? People think of Glacier National Park for good reason, going to see it sooner rather than later before the glaciers are gone. And everyone should, because it's spectacular and they will be gone. Rainier is a much more massive system of glaciers, but even seeing their recession, when I first hiked the Wonderland Trails in 2006, and even to come back in 2018 and I took a few photos from the exact same vantage point to try and see if you could notice a difference. And there were times when you could obviously see, yeah, I stood right there and I'm right near the snout of a glacier and here I am in the same spot and it's, 100 yards further away from me kind of thing. So it's visible. I mean, I think if you were to a lay person, you'd say, hey, these things look permanent. They're never going anywhere. But that's part of the fun of going back and seeing them numerous times. And I hope to do that trail many more times in my life. The sad part will be seeing how they change.
Hey, that's all the questions that I see. And Jeff, thank you so much for, coming back to us and sharing your wonderful story.
Anytime. Thanks very much, Shelby, for having me. Hope to do it again in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.